Research Director. Thank you, Pablo. Welcome, everybody, this Tuesday morning. My name is Victoria Bergeron. I am a policy researcher at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, joined today by our Research Director, Megan Callahan. We will be giving an overview of the governor's budget, diving into early education funding proposals that we see for FY 2027 by the governor. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment. If you have questions or things you are hoping that we'll cover, feel free to throw them in the chat now and we can try to get to them as we go through the presentation. We'll also be sharing the slides and the recording after we're done here today. So if there's anything kind of you're hoping we'll get to, if it's big picture, state tax revenues, if it's C3 funding, CCFA funding, we're going to go through all of that. But if there's any specific questions that you hope we'll get to, feel free to add them in the chat now. And then also, if you don't mind filling out this welcome poll for us, just to help us see who's here. And if you've come to one of our presentations before, it'll help us kind of gauge our discussion today. So I'll give everybody a minute to do that. We still have some people joining, so that's great. Thank you for coming. See if there's a few more people able to answer the poll, and then we'll get started. Awesome. All right, I'm going to close out the poll. If you haven't had a chance to answer it, no worries. But I will go ahead and share my screen with our slides. And Megan, if you could let me know if that looks correct.
Looks great.
Okay, great. And I will get started. All right. So again, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Victoria. Megan and I will be going through a presentation on the governor's FY 2027 budget and what the governor proposes for early education and care spending for this next fiscal year. I'll be starting off with a little State Budget 101. Megan's going to go through and give an overview, high-level overview of fiscal context, the overview of the governor's budget, and then I'll dive into specific early education proposals that we see. All right, so to get started, I usually like to start by defining a few frequently used budget terms you'll hear throughout this presentation and that we use when we're working on the budget. So the fiscal year, FY, abbreviated, is the schedule that the budget runs on. It goes from July 1st through June 30th. And so today we'll be talking about the fiscal year FY 2027 budget, which begins this July 1st and will run through June 30th of next year. Line items are each unique account number that funds programs, departments in the state budget, and each line item has an appropriation that defines the total funding amount included in the budget for any program or department item. Sometimes in line item language, we'll also see earmarks, which are specific funding amounts for smaller programs within larger line items. For example, we'll talk about the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative a little bit today, which is has an earmark usually for the summer step-up program. So sometimes you'll see also in the next slide, I have an example of an earmark. Conference is the process that the House and Senate go through after releasing their individual branch budgets to reconcile any differences and prepare a final proposal to be sent to the governor's desk. Outside sections are pieces of the budget which contain specific policy provisions and are ways to pass policy language through the budget. So we'll talk through if we see any of that this year, especially the past couple years in FY 2025. We saw a lot of outside section policy language related to early ed. And then finally, the General Appropriations Act, or the GAA, is what we call the final budget once it's signed into law. So you'll probably hear us compare the governor's proposal for FY 2027 with the FY 2026 GAA. And then if there's anything in the chat that I should get to, feel free to let me know, Megan or Pablo. So this is an example line item in the budget. So if you're scrolling through the State House website and you want to read through the budget, this is what a line item looks like. This is an actual example line item from the Senate budget. So you'll see the line item number code on the left, a bunch of language usually. Sometimes you'll see earmark language that denotes, again, just a call out for funding to be allocated to a specific area within the line item, and then that total appropriation number. The state budget is crafted by decision makers in the governor's administration and in the legislature. We'll be talking about the governor's budget today. So on the governor's side, the Executive Office of Administration and Finance is the governor's budget office. So they put together the governor's proposal by working with other state departments, and the budget starts here, which typically shapes discussions that we'll see later on at the legislative level. Both the House and Senate have committees on Ways and Means, their budget teams, that build the budget proposals for each branch. So the House committee is chaired by Representative Michaelwitz, and the Senate committee is chaired by Senator Rodrick. These committees take in information from the governor's budget. They take in information from the rest of the House and Senate members to inform their committee budgets as well. So we're at the first couple steps of the budget calendar right now, which started off at the beginning of the year, end of last year, with a consensus revenue agreement, which is where the budget writers in the legislature and in the governor's office, they have to decide, come to a agreement on the amount of revenue that the state will be collecting and building the budget off of for FY27. So all the three budget proposals that will come out from the governor, House, and Senate all have to be built on the same assumption of the amount of revenue they'll have to spend. And then we saw the governor's budget come out. We're talking about that today. Next, we'll go into the House and Senate processes before getting to the conference committee and final budget. So the governor filed her budget last week on the 28th. And as we'll see in early education and in other areas as well of the budget, the governor's budget usually kind of builds on agency maintenance levels and then has some key priority areas where the governor will allocate additional funds. After the governor's budget comes out, while the House is working on the beginning of their proposal, the House and Senate committees on Ways and Means come together and host joint Ways and Means hearings on different issue areas of the budget. So education will have its own hearing where the Commissioner of Early Education and Care, the Commissioner of DESE, the Commissioner of the Department of Higher Ed will all testify, and advocates testify as well on different early education funding proposed by the governor and how they hope to see those programs funded by the House and Senate. The House Ways and Means budget typically comes out the week before April break, and then the Senate sometime in mid-May. Reps and senators then file amendments after their committee budgets get released to add more local priorities, different earmark language often. And after the amendment process, then the House and the Senate debate their respective budgets before going into conference committee. So again, conference committee is quite important part of the process where everything from a semicolon to big policy language to big funding proposals have to be reconciled. Any differences between the House and the Senate budgets have to be cleared up before the conference committee can send a conference report budget to the governor, which hopefully, usually we try, the state hopes to get a final budget signed by the start of the new fiscal year on July 1st. The governor does have the ability to send vetoes back to the legislature after she receives the conference report, and the legislature can override the governor's vetoes if they have a two-thirds vote in each chamber. Once all that wraps up, the final budget signed by the governor then becomes the General Appropriations Act for FY 2027. And I'll kick it over to Megan for the next section.
Thanks, Victoria. Good morning, everybody. So as Victoria mentioned, we're going to use this middle chunk of the slides to talk about this bigger budget picture, which are really kind of the high level state spending and revenue trends that we monitor, and that hopefully provide some really helpful context for better understanding the specifics that we see in the governor's proposal for fiscal year 2027. So I'll talk about those trends that we're monitoring in just a second, but first to start off with a couple state budget fiscal basics. So the state's annual spending, or the GAA, as Victoria described, includes about $61 billion in total spending, and that supports over 700 line items. The state budget really touches every state department, agency, program, or service that's administered by the state. And the largest category of spending in the state budget is healthcare by a large margin. It makes up just under 50% of total spending in the GAA. The second largest component of state budget spending is education. And within this bucket, this spending is really driven by investments in K-12 education, and specifically a program called Chapter 70 State Aid, which provides state support to over 300 public school districts across the state. Just to give a little context for what these percentages mean, in the governor's fiscal year 27 budget proposal, she recommends funding the Chapter 70 program at about $7.6 billion. And as Victoria will get into in much greater detail, total funding for the Department of Early Education and Care in FY 27 is recommended to be about $1.9 billion. So early ed makes up a much smaller slice of the overall state budget. It represents just a little under 3% of total state budget spending. You can go to the next slide. And so we have $61 billion in spending on one side of the ledger, and that's obviously then supported by about $69 billion in total state revenues and resources. When we talk about the revenues and resources that are available to support state budget spending, we tend to talk about them in three buckets. We have tax revenues, federal grants and reimbursements, and then departmental revenues. Tax revenues obviously make up the largest slice of this pie, about 60% of overall resources available to support state budget spending. And so when we talk about looking at state revenue trends, really what we're often talking about is monitoring state tax revenue collections. We want to understand both how they compare to our expectations, how they compare to prior years, and how does tax revenue growth compare to state spending growth, because the closer in line those two things are, the more sustainable our budget. The farther away spending growth gets from expected levels of revenue growth, that's when we often end up in a situation like we're in currently, in which I'll talk about in more detail, in which we talk about a more constricted revenue picture, in which there aren't as many discretionary resources to go around to support new or expanded spending initiatives. You can go to the next slide. So now to get into some of those trends that we're looking at, and we'll start by talking about those revenue trends. And in this graph, we're looking at a couple of different things. So the blue bars here are looking at base tax revenue collections and projections between FY19 and our current fiscal year, FY 2026. The light blue portions of the bars starting in FY23, that's surtax revenue or fair share revenue that's generated by the millionaire's tax. And then the yellow line here is looking at what tax revenue trends would have looked like if we had stayed on a pretty steady state from 2019 through the current day. So if we hadn't experienced any of those kind of crazy post-pandemic years. So that's the information that we're looking at in this chart, and there are a couple of key trends to point out here. The first is that between fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 23, the years immediately following the pandemic, we were in a period of high revenue growth. And this is when tax revenue collections were pretty consistently and significantly outpacing our expectations. From FY24 through FY26, you can see we've been in a period of pretty low to basically no state tax revenue growth. Tax revenue collections have essentially come back in line with where we would have expected them to be prior to the pandemic. And for the last 3 to 4 years, we've basically been treading water. In fact, FY26 is the first year in which base tax revenue collections were projected to reach the high watermark that we reached back in FY22 of $41.1 billion. You can go to the next slide. So those are our high level revenue trends. We had a period of high growth followed by a period of stagnation, which we're still kind of in at this moment. But we haven't seen that stagnation really translate over to the spending side of the budget. Between FY22 and FY26, average annual growth in GAA spending has been about 5.6%. And while that is lower than the pandemic era highs of spending growth that we saw of 9.1% or 6.9% growth in FY23 and FY24, at 5.6%, that average is still a decent bit higher than sustainable levels of revenue growth. One of the things that we have written about in some of our budget analysis has been that over time, what we would expect is that revenue collections are going to tend to fall in the 3 to 4% range. And so ideally, what we would see is year-over-year spending growth in that range as well. That's going to be a sustainable budget that we can have confidence that we'll be able to support moving into future fiscal years. Go to the next slide. Of course, one of the reasons why even during this period of low to no revenue growth, we've still been able to support increasing levels of state spending is because we have had access to some new and expanded revenues. And really that's come in the form of fair share revenue or surtax revenue. These resources were first introduced to the operating budget in fiscal year 24. And between fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 26, the surtax has supported $4.7 billion in new spending for education and transportation initiatives. In FY27, the amount of surtax revenue that's available to support operating budget spending is $2.7 billion, which is getting pretty close to the total amount of surtax revenues that we expect to collect in a fiscal year. And if we go to the next slide, I'll highlight that there are just a couple of kind of warning signs related to surtax spending that we've started to flag in some of our analysis and for policymakers that are just helpful to keep in mind as we think about the sustainability of the surtax going forward and the sustainability of the spending that it's used to support. So as I mentioned, in FY27, the amount of surtax revenue that's available to support operating budget spending is $2.7 billion. And over the last couple of years, the average annual total surtax revenue that we've collected is about $3 billion, $2.9 billion between FY24 and FY25. As we spend more and more of these resources in the operating budget, it raises a couple of obstacles. The first is that over time, we expect surtax revenues to be volatile. They're highly correlated to things like stock market performance and non-withheld income. And we just don't have a lot of historic revenue data available to say with absolute certainty that every year we can expect to collect at least $3 billion in revenue. And so what that means, if we're spending all of it in the operating budget, is that we could be introducing some new exposures to state budget spending. And we don't want to do that when we think about the big programs, the big important programs that this surtax revenue has been used to support. The other challenge that it creates is that the more of these resources that we spend in the operating budget, the smaller the amount of surtax revenue there is to be deposited into a couple of new funds that were created when we were first putting in place the structure on how to spend and use surtax revenues in the budget. Revenues collected above what is spent in the operating budget get deposited into a surtax reserve fund, which is kind of like a stabilization fund for surtax supported spending. And then also this new innovation and capital fund. The innovation and capital fund, those resources can then be used to support additional supplemental spending for education and transportation. And predominantly, they should be used to support one-time or capital related costs. Last year, the Innovation and Capital Fund supported $1.3 billion in supplemental spending, of which nearly 30 million was for early education and care. This year, on the same day that the governor filed her FY27 budget proposal, she put forward another supplemental budget proposal, also supported by these Innovation and Capital Fund resources, about $1.2 billion in spending, of which 150 million is for early education and care. So the resources in that fund have been a really critical source of support for both education and transportation. And we think going forward, it's helpful to maintain a healthy balance in that fund. And that balance will just start to become lower the more surtax that we adopt into the operating budget. So those are just a couple of things that we're starting to monitor pretty closely when we think about fair share revenues. You can go to the next slide. And then this is my last slide in this section before turning to the governor's budget. But here we're just looking at what the expectations are for tax revenue growth in FY27. So as Victoria mentioned, the first step in the budget process is this consensus revenue hearing, which leads to a consensus revenue agreement. And this is when policymakers from the administration and the legislature agree to a tax revenue foundation that each branch is going to use to build their budget proposals. So for FY27, policymakers expect the state to collect $42.2 billion in base non-fair share revenues. That's about 2.4% growth over last year. And when we add in the surtax spending of 2.7 billion, in total, they have about $44.9 billion in resources available to support state budget spending. That's 1.3 billion or about 2.9% above what was available last year. So helpful to keep this 2.4% in base tax revenue growth number and the 2.9% overall revenue growth number in mind when we now turn to the governor's budget to look at overall spending trends. So getting into the governor's budget, I'll talk about spending in a second, but we typically like to start with these top 5 things to know list. And the first thing we think is important to know is that spending growth in the governor's budget is down, but it still exceeds our expected level of tax revenue growth. So overall spending in the governor's budget is about $63.4 billion, and that's a 3.8% increase over the FY26 budget that was signed into law last year. That is lower than the 5.5% spending growth that we saw in the FY26 GAA, but notably you'll see that that's higher than the 2.4% in base tax revenue growth and 2.9% growth when we add in the surtax revenues that are available to support spending. The second thing we think it's important to know about the governor's budget, and this will be true for the legislature as well, is that even before we start to think about new or expanded spending in FY27, one of the first tasks ahead of budget writers was to close a projected budget gap of about $3 billion. The administration does successfully close that gap using a range of revenue and spending proposals, and addressing a gap like this at the beginning of a fiscal year isn't totally out of the norm. Every year there's some level of a gap that needs to be addressed. But one of the questions as the budget process moves forward is now going to be, does the House and the Senate use the same framework to close the budget gap that the administration deployed? And if they do things differently, does that impact the amount of revenue available to support those new or expanded spending needs? Our third takeaway is that the surtax through both the FY27 budget proposal and the Innovation and Capital Fund SUP supports $4 billion in spending for education and transportation. And then a couple of specific spending takeaways. What we see in the governor's budget is that the administration really focuses on fulfilling a couple of long-standing commitments in the K-12 education space and for the MBTA. As it relates to K-12 education, that includes things like fully funding the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, which was a law signed in 2019 that reformed the way that we fund public schools in Massachusetts. And then in terms of the MBTA, that really means following through on a couple of recommendations from the Transportation Finance Task Force, which were released in early 2025. And then lastly, we think it's important to note that healthcare spending growth is down in the governor's budget, particularly compared to prior years. So in the governor's proposal for FY27, spending for mass health increases by about 1%. That's remarkably less than what we saw mass health spending grow by last year, which was 10%. And the reason why this is relevant to every other area of the budget is that the state is, I think, undertaking a couple of different initiatives to think about how we can constrain healthcare spending growth. And when we do that, that opens up the resources that are available for other areas of the budget. Because if healthcare were to grow every year at 10%, very quickly we're going to crowd out the resources that are available for other areas. You can go to the next slide. Here we just walk through that projected budget gap that the administration and the legislature are responsible for closing in FY27. And in the table on the right side of this slide, this is MTF's estimate that we put together as we were preparing for the governor's budget to kind of get a better sense ourselves of really what this challenge was going to look like. So pretty quickly, using some basic revenue and spending assumptions, we were able to identify this initial gap of about $3.4 billion. And when we saw the revenue and the spending solutions included in the governor's budget, they aligned pretty well with this estimate. And so, again, looking at a budget gap of this size is notable, but starting the fiscal year with a budget gap that budget writers are responsible for solving does happen every year. It's more a question of just what are the solutions that are proposed to close it? Do they differ as the process moves through the legislature? And then how does that impact the resources that are available to support spending once this gap is addressed? You can go to the next slide. And so then when we look at big picture spending themes in the governor's budget, I think a couple of things stand out. The first is that when we break down spending by category, we see that the largest spending growth is really in the healthcare, education, and support services categories, which I'd say is pretty typical year over year. These are the same three categories that we saw experiencing the largest spending growth in the FY26 budget as well. The other thing that jumps out when we break down spending like this is that if you look at the other end of the chart, it looks like transportation spending is actually decreasing year over year. This breakdown excludes surtax revenues. And so what this is actually telling us is that a greater share of transportation spending has now been shifted onto the surtax. And so it looks like a decrease, but once the surtax is included, spending does increase year over year for transportation. And the next slide. And then just to get into a little bit more of the specifics on the programs that are really driving the spending growth that we see in the governor's budget. In the table on the left side of the slide, we look at the top 10 programs in the governor's proposal that see the largest year-over-year increases in spending. And these programs align with the same categories that we saw in the prior chart. They're programs related to healthcare, specifically Mass Health or the Group Insurance Commission. Programs related to education, of course, Chapter 78, but also some special education costs. And then support services, namely because of this new transportation program for human services, which addresses a number of, DDS or mass health transportation needs. We have highlighted here the two childcare financial assistance programs, both DCF and DTA related childcare and income eligible childcare. When we compare the governor's proposal to the budget signed into law last July, both of these programs see large nominal increases. It's important to note that there was some supplemental spending for CCFA throughout FY26, and so the actual increase is a little bit smaller than this comparison would suggest. But even still, we do see some increased funding to help maintain the current rate and access structure for CCFA. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Victoria to get into some of the specifics of what we're seeing for funding for EEC.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So yes, I'll be going through early education as we see it in the governor's budget. Before I get into the details, though, I just wanted to spend a few moments on the mechanics of the budget for early ed. So if you're looking for early education spending in the budget, it's going to be found in two main areas, line items starting with the number 3,000 and then fair share line items starting with the number 1596. Sometimes line item funding is also split between multiple revenue sources. like we have seen for C3 and CCFA in recent years, including in the governor's proposal for this year. The graphic here, I really just like how it illustrates the complicated web of funding that we can often see for early ed. And this is an example showing funding streams that were used in FY 2025 to support childcare financial assistance, the Commonwealth Cares for Children program, the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, and Head Start. Between FY 2020 and FY 2026, funding for EEC has more than doubled, growing by more than $1 billion. The chart here shows how that initial funding was supported first by additional federal dollars during the pandemic, which you can see in the blue bars, and how the state has since taken up that funding responsibility as those federal funds expired. EEC has also received funding in several supplemental budgets, like Megan mentioned, over the past 2 years. The orange bar in FY 2025 represents a supplemental budget at the end of FY 25 that was used to support needs in CCFA. And then in FY 26, EEC also received some money in the Fair Share supplemental budget that Megan mentioned. As you can see, the overall trend here has been increases initially supported by federal funding, and then we have seen those increases continue but start to level out since FY25. So we will delve into what that has looked like for specific programs as I continue in the presentation. So as I mentioned, there are multiple funding sources that support EEC spending. A majority of the funding in the total state budget, like Megan said, comes from the state's general fund that collects tax revenue and federal funding as well. The chart on the right here breaks down the percent of federal funding from the Child Care and Development Block Grant Fund that has gone to support EEC since FY 2018. This funding we don't see directly in the state budget because the state receives reimbursements from the federal government from this fund to support CCFA, but roughly federal funding makes up about 20% of EEC's budget. Megan also mentioned the Fair Share income surtax, which goes to support education and transportation spending. This has been a very important source of funding for EEC for the past few years, particularly for those big programs like C3, CCFA, and CPPI. Finally, there are two trust funds that I'll mention today, the EEC High Quality and Affordability Trust Fund and the Operational Grant Trust Fund. And here we can see how these revenue sources have contributed to EEC's budget the past few years, including in the governor's proposal for FY 2027. You'll notice in particular the dark blue piece of the bars there that represents the general fund has stayed pretty level, around $1 billion, while the use of surtax, which we see in purple, has grown. The pink sections in FY 26 and FY 27 note the appropriations for EEC in the Fair Share supplemental budget. And the governor's proposal in her supplemental Fair Share proposal allocates $150 million of surplus surtax to be transferred to the High Quality and Affordability Trust Fund. So we include it in the chart here because of that appropriation, but since the proposal directs that fund be transferred to the High Quality and Affordability Trust Fund to be used in FY 27 for CCFA, that actually gets folded back into that orange piece there. So top 5 things to know for early ed in the governor's budget. Like Megan said, total EEC spending in the governor's proposal equals about $1.9 billion, which is $182 million or a little more than 10% higher than the FY 2026 budget. C3, Commonwealth Cares for Children, is level funded at $475 million. The governor proposes funding CCFA at a total of $1.2 billion, which is $133 million above total funding provided for the program in FY 2026 when we include funding that was included in the Fair Share supplemental budget. Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, or CPPI, is funded at $37 million in the governor's proposal, which is $16.5 million higher than the level for the program in FY 2026. This is really the main area of proposed increase for EEC that we see in the governor's budget. Most other areas for EEC program spending received level funding by the governor, reflecting largely a maintenance approach, given the spending and revenue constraints that Megan walked through. I'm not going to walk through this chart in detail, but you'll receive the slides afterwards. So if you'd like to take a look at some of the other program appropriations and how the governor funds them compared to the past 2 years, you can take a look. But I'll be diving into next childcare financial assistance, C3, and some other areas. All right, so CCFA. CCFA is the largest state program for childcare in the state, funding access for high quality, affordable childcare for over 60,000 children across the state. I think it's roughly 65,000 children right now. And importantly, CCFA is actually three separate programs. It's assistance for children with cases at the Department of Children and Families, assistance for children whose families are receiving support from the Department of Transitional Assistance, and assistance for children in income eligible families. Together, funding for these three programs has gone up by more than $600 million since FY 2018, reaching over $1 billion in FY 2025. This increase in funding has gone to expand access to CCFA and towards increasing reimbursement rates to childcare providers who serve children receiving CCFA. So often you'll hear about CCFA funding in two buckets, access funding and rate funding. And so we kind of break that out here, but in the budget, we see this funding pooled together in the two main line items for CCFA. Between FY 2020 and FY 2025, the income eligible caseload for CCFA has grown by 57%, and the DCF and DTA caseloads have grown by 78%. At the same time, the state has been able to invest more in our providers, appropriating $240 million for new reimbursement rate increases since FY 18. And importantly, CCFA funding is naturally not one time. All this funding to maintain access and increase rates have to be annualized or built into following year budgets continuously. This slide walks you through the idea of annualization and how it works, particularly when we talk about funding for rate increases. We have to think about annualization and how that fits into the larger budget picture for CCFA. This example chart here just gives you an idea of how the process works with this example program. Say this program is funded at $100 million in year one. In year two, the budget includes a $50 million funding for rate increases. So the total funding for the program now rises to $150 million. In year three, budget makers have to take into account that previous rate increase and build that into the base funding for that program. If you continuously build new rate increases on top of that, pretty quickly you get to a scenario like in this year four, where total funding for the program has doubled. It used to be $100 million, now it's $200 million, but half of that $100 million is being used to support previous rate increases. So rate increases for CCFA in recent years have meant that providers have been able to receive more funding to invest in their program and in their educators, as rates have typically gone towards salary increases. EC has done a lot of work in the past few years to bring rates more in line with the actual cost providers face, and use that actual cost calculation instead of market rates, which fall often far below the true cost of care. So this is just something to keep in mind as we think about the total funding for CCFA and how rates play a role in that. So in FY 2027, the governor's proposal funds CCFA at about $1.2 billion, $597.2 million for DCF DTA, and $623.6 million for income eligible. When accounting for funding that was included in FY26 in the Fair Share Supplemental Budget. Again, this comes to about $133.3 million above FY26 levels for CCFA. The governor includes CCFA funding in those main two line items for DCF, DTA, and income eligible programs. And she did not include any additional line item funding for reducing the income eligible wait list or for providing a new rate increase in FY27. So, what does this mean? It is our understanding that the governor's funding level would annualize current rate levels and would provide enough funding to keep up with the current caseload and support anticipated increases to the DCF DTA caseload in FY27. You can see in the chart here in the pink line, and as we've mentioned, the DCF DTA caseload in particular has been growing faster than the income eligible caseload. And because the DCF DTA programs are what are known as entitlement programs, which means the state is obligated to provide funding and support the funding for those programs as need and demand increase. That is why we see the funding level for DCF DTA continuing to increase and the increase that we see in the nominal funding for CCFA is likely to keep up with projected increases for DCF DTA. The income eligible program, however, is not an entitlement program and access is dependent on funding. So the governor's funding level proposed for FY27 does not appear to offer additional funding to expand income eligible access to vouchers for children who are currently on the wait list beyond those who would qualify for CCFA under the continuity of care provision. I'll pause there for any questions that we see, or we can get to them at the end on CCFA. Okay. So C3, Commonwealth Cares for Children Grant Program. This is probably a little overview for those who already know, but C3 was originally funded with federal pandemic funds. During the pandemic, Massachusetts is very impressively the only state to be able to continue our pandemic era operational grant program since federal funding expired. But C3 has been level funded at $475 million since the state took over full funding of the program. This chart just kind of illustrates the impact of surtax and trust funds to be able to support C3 over the past few years. So the governor proposes funding C3 again at $475 million in FY27, and she uses largely the surtax as well as the Operational Grant Trust Fund to support the program. So you'll see $40 million from the general fund, $75 million from the Operational Grant Trust Fund, and $360 million from the surtax to add up to that $475 million total figure for C3. The governor uses the Operational Grant Trust Fund, which is expected to take in revenue from the state's new online lottery program starting this year. Going forward, iLottery revenue is expected to grow year over year and is projected to generate over $300 million by year 10 of the program. But this is going to be the first year of implementation, so the expectation is that the iLottery will collect $75 million, and the governor proposes using that total amount to support C3. Given the constraints that Megan walked through earlier, maintenance funding by the governor for C3 and CCFA and other areas in early ed is quite positive news given the context. However, level funding for C3 means that the program will be continued to be closed to new childcare providers as it has been since last July. A few weeks ago, we put out a fact sheet on C3 detailing how the program has been able to raise educator salaries and support the opening of new programs and the expansion of classrooms, but how increased operating costs and continued level funding would erode C3's impact over time. So this is really an area that we're going to watch as the budget moves to the legislature next and see how the House and the Senate propose funding C3 for FY27. I also just wanted to take a moment today to note how the two biggest state early education programs work together. CCFA and C3 serve a majority of programs in the Commonwealth. childcare programs in the Commonwealth. And thus, they impact most families who use formal early education care in the state and our early education workforce. They are often talked about separately, but really they interact both directly and indirectly. The legislature included language in FY 25 in statute that C3 should help incentivize participation in CCFA through its grant formula. So programs that want to receive C3 grants must now certify a willingness to provide care to children receiving CCFA, and programs that serve greater percentages of children receiving CCFA are also eligible for enhanced C3 benefits as well. However, if CCFA voucher access remains limited, that incentive is weakened. And even if funding for vouchers is expanded, then level funding for C3 would also place constraints on EC's ability to implement the grant formula most effectively and as intended. The two programs are really both critical for supporting the workforce, for investing in high quality care, and for expanding access and affordability to families. So just wanted to highlight kind of the intricate nature of the two programs today. Just wrapping up here on some other programs included in the governor's budget. Again, the main area where we saw an increase in the funding level by the governor for early ed was in the CPPI, Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. The governor funds CPPI at $37 million. Most of that, $32 million, does come from the surtax. And we see that this funding level appears to be consistent with the governor's goal of expanding CPPI to all gateway cities by the end of 2026. Also, wanted to note Head Start. So Head Start is largely is a federal program and is government. Head Start programs receive federal funding directly from the federal government, and that money does not flow through the state budget. But the state budget does include some funding for supplemental state grants to Head Start, which the governor funds level at $20 million. Just wanted to note that we are also tracking movement at the federal level and budget negotiations happening in Washington. I believe as of now, we are still under a partial government shutdown as negotiations are happening at the House. So we'll have to see kind of how the funding for Head Start and other childcare programs is included in the final appropriations bills that are being debated upon. Lastly, a few other things. The governor's budget included $3 million for the Career Pathways Higher Education Program for early educators, which is level with the amount that the program received in FY 2026. But just wanted to note that that EEC also used additional surtax funds to support career pathways over the past year. So $3 million level funding in the line item is really not inclusive of all the funding that has been used to run the program. The governor also included $20 million for the child care resource and referral agencies, again, level with FY26. And then a few things that we did not see in the governor's budget were funding for the early educator scholarship program, early educator loan forgiveness program, or any specific earmarks to support early educator CCFA. And again, we did not see funding for reimbursement rate increase in FY 27 by the governor. And just wrapping up here. So the next step in the process is the Joint Ways and Means Committee hearing. We'll be seeing when the education hearing is scheduled. Last year it was at the end of March, so that'll be kind of the first public opportunity for folks to testify in support of different priorities. And again, we'll be waiting to see the House Ways and Means budget come out in April, and then the House will go into budget amendment and debate as well. I kind of already touched on this, but we're tracking appropriations discussions at the federal level, and we'll see what the final amounts are included for child care and development block grant, for Head Start, and for the preschool development block grants as well. And then lastly, the top 5 questions we'll be asking as we look to the next stage of the budget. Will the House and Senate also level fund C3 If they propose an expansion, kind of what resources do they use to do that? Will the House and Senate propose additional funding to expand CCFA access or rates? How will the Fair Share supplemental budget play a role? And will we see that same transfer of surtax to the High Quality and Affordability Trust Fund? Four, will we see any outside section language related to early ed? Like I said, a few years ago, there was a lot of policy language related to CCFA and C3 included in the final budget. So will we see any new proposals included by the House or the Senate? And then finally, how will larger economic trends and federal action impact the bigger budget picture and early education spending by the legislature? Thank you all so much. I know that was a lot of information. I'll go ahead and take the slides down and we can take any questions that we have.
We did get a question in the chat asking kind of what's the difference between the governor proposing to spend 150 million in surplus or tax revenues to the trust fund and then appropriating those same resources in the FY27 budget as opposed to just sending 150 million in the supplemental budget directly to EEC. And in terms of how those resources can be used, there's really no difference in terms of any constraints or anything that might be on that funding. I think the purpose behind sending the funding first to the trust fund and then reappropriating out of that trust fund in the operating budget is that it can be a little bit cleaner in the FY27 budget to be appropriating those resources from a trust fund as opposed to connecting it back to an appropriation in the supplemental budget. But honestly, there's not like a greater reason kind of above and beyond that. The dollars kind of do the same thing in terms of using them to support FY27 funding.
Great, thank you. Let's see if there were other questions. I see one on summer step up and CPPI. So I don't believe there was not a specific earmark for summer step up in the governor's language, but I think our understanding is that about $5 million of CPPI funding would go to that program. And then we might see that kind of spelled out more in the House or Senate budgets. Mm.
We had another question about sharing some examples of departmental revenue. That can get confusing because it doesn't sound like there's a big difference. Basically, departmental revenues are those resources collected by departments related to specific programs or services offered by the state. So, an example related to early education is licensing fees from early educators. So, the department collects licensing fees, and then those revenues can be available to support state budget spending. Another example are like state-run beaches. If you pay to park at the beach and the state collects that revenue, those resources are considered departmental and can be used to support spending as well. But departmental revenues make up a much smaller piece of the overall resource pie.
And then I see also some comments on the income eligible funding for CCFA. It's definitely a crucial piece that we will be watching as you say in the chat. That access has been pretty limited for a few years. So the wait list for income eligible continues to grow, and it's difficult to kind of break through that. And then I also see a question on the early educator scholarship and pieces that we didn't see incorporated in the governor's budget. Is it worth advocating for those in the House and Senate? Absolutely. That is the next part of the process, and I think often we'll see the governor include fewer specifications for earmarks in general, not just in early education, that then get added back in the House and Senate. So definitely still part of the conversation. And then Harold asked about the mechanisms that the state could use if tax revenue does not meet our goals. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if tax revenues fall short of expectations, there are kind of a couple tools that the state has at its disposals. I think first and foremost, the state will try to look for other resources, whether they be from trust funds or other kind of sources of revenue to help maintain like program funding levels. And so, a reduction in tax revenue expectations doesn't always equal an equal reduction in spending. However, it has it's happened in the past. If tax revenues are projected to come significantly below expectations, that can sometimes necessitate spending cuts. So I think as we've talked about in other presentations, the governor has what's called 9C authority, which basically gives her the ability to reduce spending levels if the administration determines that tax revenues are falling below benchmark to such an extent that spending reductions are required. But again, I will say that if you're following along with monthly state tax revenue collections and you're seeing that they're falling below expectations, that doesn't mean an equal reduction in spending. There are resource solutions that will try to be pursued first, and then kind of the worst case scenario is if spending reductions need to be pursued.
And I'll also just add in terms of the like timeline for the budget and the calendar that goes along with the timeline for tax revenues coming in. The House budget comes out in April. We'll see April revenues, so sometimes you'll see different strategies going into the Senate budget and the conference budget process if there's any major changes to how revenue is looking later in the calendar year. And then we have a question also if how we kind of think about in more broadly the House or Senate budgets differing greatly from the governor's in other areas as well as early ed.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say how the legislature's budget proposals differ from the governor's budget is different every year. There's not a hard and fast rule. I'd say for a few of those kind of post-pandemic years, the years in which we saw tax revenues exceeding expectations, we saw both in the House and the Senate go further in spending more than what was initially proposed in the governor's budget. Notably, last year, the FY26 budget, we saw both the House and the Senate spend significantly less than the governor's original proposal. In fact, the final budget that was signed into law was about $1 billion below the governor's original proposal. And so each year, I think the legislature identifies priorities that might differ from what the administration's original proposal are. And the extent of that difference is really dependent on the resources that are available. Some of those solutions that I mentioned that get pursued to close an initial budget gap or maybe generate resources to support new and expanded spending. Generally, I'd say this year, I wouldn't be shocked to see at least a similar approach to last year, in which we might not see the House and the Senate go further than the governor. And in fact, it might be more likely to see them spend a little bit less than the governor's initial proposal.
All right. I don't know if I see any other questions, but I'll just put my email again in the chat if folks have any questions as you look more into the governor's budget or are reaching out to your representatives or senators, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you all for joining us.